raised?
Born and raised in southeast Pennsylvania. Went up to New York City and got a bachelor's, and went to Drexel for my master's, out to Oregon State for my PhD. And prior to arriving here at Horn Point, I was up at University of Maine at the Darling Marine Center. I mean, it's an obvious place to wind up as a oyster researcher, because of, the eastern oyster is an iconic species. Oyster restoration is going on at a very large scale in the Chesapeake Bay, and my specialty is oyster restoration and ecology.
But undergrad in Maine, actually worked on soft-shell clams and crab interactions, and then did my PhD in Southern California at USC in LA on oyster kind of quantitative genetics, so genetics of breeding essentially, and then did my postdoc at Clemson University on barnacle genomics, so not really oysters, and then got the opportunity to come here in 2013, and so I was hired here to sort of do oyster work. I think oyster genetics was one of the reasons I was hired, and so that's sort of my specialty or my discipline is sort of molecular genetics and then now some genomics, trying to make use of all the massive amounts of data now we can collect for oysters or humans or whoever. And we have a currently funded project, which is awesome and fun, and we're hoping to do more of that. The idea is looking at trying to understand what happens, how oysters might change when they're bred in a hatchery environment over many generations. So, we're producing oysters on a massive scale for restoration in Chesapeake Bay, and that's going to happen in other places too. But when you bring animals into the hatchery, you can alter their life history. You're controlling the environment they're reared in, which is good because you have better survival rates at different life stages. But that also could alter some of the important traits that these oysters have, because you basically change the environment. So we're concerned potentially about domestication selection, where you might alter traits in a lab or a hatchery environment that aren't necessarily good for how the oyster perform once they're back in the wild. So that's been shown in salmon that go through the hatchery on the West Coast, because they have a lot of restoration on the West Coast, or it happens in fruit fly populations that you bring into the lab to study developmental genetics. When you put them in these lab environments, it's just really different from the wild, and so things change. So we're looking at the genetics, hopefully, as one part of it, but also just some of the actual traits. The trait we're focusing on is feeding, because it's a hypothesis. We think feeding behavior, feeding physiology might change over many generations of propagation in the hatchery. So that's
we wanted to drill down on the physiology, and that being my background, I knew about some really advanced techniques that can be applied to really draw out some of the really fundamental physiological traits that might be at play when it comes to how these animals might be coping with starvation stress and stuff like that.
So the preliminary work suggested that, so the basic design of the study is we have these wild oysters that have never been in the hatchery. We bring them in and we expose their offspring, their larvae, to starvation stress. And then we also have these long-term aquaculture lines that have gone through many generations of hatchery propagation, where we think domestication changes might have occurred. So we have these two comparisons, and we are basically looking at these two groups, and we're trying to understand how they respond to starvation. We basically don't give their larvae any food, and we want to see who performs better. So what we thought we would see is that the wild offspring do better, the larvae produced by wild oysters that have never been in the hatchery, and what we're seeing is it's not quite clear that's actually what we're seeing.
We did a number of spawns this summer, and we collected a lot of data, and we're at the very beginning of the analysis. We're still just collecting it and trying to get into one spreadsheet to really analyze it. I think that any result that we get is going to be interesting, and the fact that aquaculture lines may have larvae that are more resilient to starvation stress is certainly interesting, and we're dealing in a theoretical right now, and this is just a topic that people really haven't explored in the oyster aquaculture world, and we just want to kind of get ahead of it, I think.